The crisp autumn air bit at the hunters' noses as they made their way deeper into the woods. The leaves had turned a brilliant shade of orange and gold, rustling beneath their boots as they tracked their prey. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend away from the hustle and bustle of the city, but something felt off. As they moved deeper into the woods, they couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves set their hearts racing. The group of 6 men pushed on, determined to bag their prize. After several hours of tracking, they finally came across their target, a massive buck with antlers that spanned at least 6 feet. The excitement of the hunt overtook their fear, and they set to work stalking their prey. As they trailed the buck, the woods grew eerily quiet, save for the sound of their breathing and the occasional snap of a branch. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream pierced the air, followed by the sound of something crashing through the underbrush. The hunters froze, unsure of what to do. One of their group was missing, and the sound had come from the direction he had been heading. They fumbled for their flashlights and guns, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. That's when they saw it, a pair of glowing eyes, reflecting back at them from the darkness. The eyes belonged to a massive creature, something unlike anything they had ever seen before. It was almost 6 feet tall, covered in matted fur, with razor-sharp claws and teeth. The creature let out a guttural growl, and the hunters knew they were in trouble. They were no longer the hunters. They were the prey. The hunters quickly realized that their guns were no match for the creature. It moved too fast and was too agile for them to get a clean shot. The only option left was to run, and run they did. The group scattered, each heading in a different direction, hoping to outrun the creature. But it was no use. The creature was faster and stronger than any of them had anticipated. One by one, the hunters fell. Their screams echoed through the woods as the creature closed in on them, tearing them limb from limb. The remaining hunters could hear the sickening crunch of bones and the sound of flesh being ripped apart. As the night wore on, the group dwindled down to just 2 hunters. They had managed to climb a tree, hoping to wait up the creature until morning. But the creature was not giving up that easily. It circled the tree, growling and snarling, its claws scraping against the bark. The hunters knew they couldn't hold out much longer. They were tired, hungry, and terrified. They whispered frantically to each other, trying to come up with a plan. Suddenly, one of the hunters had an idea. He would climb down from the tree and try to lure the creature away, giving the other hunter a chance to escape. The plan was risky, but they didn't have any other options. The hunter climbed down from the tree and crept quietly towards the creature. The creature's attention was immediately drawn to the movement, and it turned to face the hunter. The hunter bolted, running as fast as he could in the opposite direction. The creature pursued him, crashing through the underbrush and tearing apart everything in its path. As the remaining hunter watched from the safety of the tree, he saw his friend disappear into the darkness. He didn't know if his friend would make it out alive, but he knew he had to try and escape himself. He waited until the creature was out of sight, then climbed down from the tree and took off in the opposite direction. He ran as fast as he could, not stopping until he had reached the edge of the woods. When he emerged from the trees, he collapsed on the ground, gasping for air. He didn't know if he was the only one left alive, but he knew one thing for sure: he would never go hunting in the woods again. The sun was shining, and the birds were chirping as the Johnson family began their hike into the deep woods. Peter, the father, had always loved the outdoors, and he was excited to share his passion with his wife Sarah and their 2 children, 10-year-old Emily and 8-year-old Daniel. As they walked deeper into the woods, the family marveled at the stunning views of the tall trees and the sounds of the babbling brook. They enjoyed the fresh air, and it was an experience they would never forget. But as they took a rest near a clearing, they realized they had taken a wrong turn and lost their way. At first, they were not too worried. Peter had a map and a compass, and they assumed it would be easy to get back on track. However, as they tried to retrace their steps, they started to notice strange markings on the trees. They looked like claw marks, and some of the trees had chunks of bark missing. The family was puzzled, but they continued to follow the compass. As the day wore on, the family became more and more lost. They heard strange noises in the distance, and Emily thought she saw something moving in the shadows. They were all starting to feel anxious, and they decided to set up camp for the night. hoping to find their way back in the morning. That night, they heard strange noises outside their tent. It sounded like something was scratching at the fabric, trying to get in. Peter got his flashlight and peered out, but he could not see anything. They tried to reassure each other that it was probably just an animal, but the atmosphere was tense, and they all had trouble sleeping. As the sun rose the next day, they packed up their gear and continued on their journey, determined to find their way back to civilization. But they soon realized that they were not alone in the woods. There was something stalking them, watching their every move, waiting for the right moment to strike. The family was lost, afraid, and they had no idea what was coming for them. As the day progressed, the family kept encountering more strange markings on the trees. The claw marks appeared to be fresher than before, as if they were being made in real time. They also heard unexplainable noises that seemed to come from all around them. It was as if the woods were alive and watching them. Emily and Daniel were getting increasingly scared, and Sarah was trying her best to comfort them. But Peter's focus was on finding a way back to civilization. He knew they had to keep moving if they wanted to survive. Suddenly, they heard a loud growl that echoed through the trees. It was deep and guttural, unlike any animal noise they had ever heard. They froze, unsure of what to do next. Then, they saw movement in the distance. A dark shape was darting between the trees, and they realized it was the entity that had been stalking them. Peter knew they had to move quickly, but he also knew they could not outrun whatever was after them. He quickly made the decision to split up. He told Sarah to take Emily and head in one direction, while he took Daniel in another. They agreed on a meeting point and went their separate ways. As Peter and Daniel moved through the woods, they heard the entity getting closer. It was getting louder, and they knew they were running out of time. Suddenly, they stumbled upon a small cave. It was their only chance for survival, so they quickly crawled inside and waited. They could hear the entity getting closer and closer. It was just outside the cave, snarling and clawing at the ground. Peter held Daniel close, trying to keep him quiet. He knew that if the entity found them, it would be the end. Just as they thought it was all over, the entity suddenly stopped. They could hear it walking away, growling softly. They waited in the cave for a long time, too scared to move. Eventually, they decided to venture out, hoping the entity had left for good. They reunited with Sarah and Emily, who had also encountered the entity but had managed to hide in the nearby cave. The family quickly left the woods and called for help. They were eventually rescued, but they were left with the haunting memory of the entity that had stalked them in the deep woods. Years later, when they talked about the incident, they could still feel the fear and unease that came with being lost in the woods and stalked by an unknown entity. They knew that they were lucky to have survived, and they were grateful for the lessons they had learned about the dangers of the great outdoors. It was a crisp autumn day when 5 friends decided to rent a cabin in the deep woods for a weekend getaway. They had all been friends since childhood and were excited to spend some time together, away from the stress of their daily lives. The cabin was secluded, surrounded by tall trees, and far from civilization. It was exactly what they wanted: peace, quiet, and a chance to connect with nature. But as soon as they arrived, they felt a strange sense of unease. The cabin was old and worn, with creaky floorboards and musty smell. It was clear that no one had lived there for a long time, but that was not what made them uncomfortable. There was something else, something they couldn't quite put their finger on. As they settled in, they began to explore the cabin. They found an old journal, which detailed the history of the cabin. It had been built by a family who had lived there for generations, but there was a dark secret hidden in the pages. According to the journal, the family had been tormented by a vengeful spirit. It had started with small things, objects moving on their own, strange noises in the night. But it had escalated quickly, becoming more and more violent. The family had tried everything to get rid of the spirit, but nothing had worked. In the end, they had abandoned the cabin, never to return. The friends were unsettled by the story, but they brushed it off as superstition. They were modern people, rational and logical. There had to be a logical explanation for everything. But as the night fell and the darkness crept in, they started to feel differently. The atmosphere was oppressive, heavy, and full of dread. It was as if something was watching them, waiting for them to let their guard down. As they sat around the fire, Trying to ignore the feeling of unease, they heard a sound. It was a low, guttural growl coming from outside. They all froze, listening intently. But as suddenly as it had come, the sound stopped. They looked at each other, unsure of what to do. Should they investigate or stay put? They decided to stay put, thinking it was just an animal passing by. But as the night went on, the sounds became more frequent, more intense. They heard footsteps outside, heavy breathing, and even whispers. They tried to convince themselves that it was just their imagination, but it was clear that something was happening. Something was out there, watching them, waiting for them to make a mistake. They huddled together, trying to find comfort in each other's presence, but it was no use. The fear was too great, too overwhelming. They were trapped, hunted by a vengeful spirit that would not rest until it had its revenge. The next morning, the friends woke up to find that things had escalated. The windows were shattered, the furniture was overturned, and there were scratches on the walls. They were scared and confused, wondering what had happened during the night. They tried to leave, but they found that they were trapped. The doors were blocked, and the windows were too high to reach. As they tried to figure out what to do, they noticed something strange. The scratches on the walls formed a message. It was a warning, a plea for help. It read, "Get out before it's too late." They knew they had to leave, but they didn't know how. They searched for a phone or a radio, but there was no signal. They were completely cut off from the outside world. The only thing they could do was try to survive until someone found them. But as the day went on, they realized that they were not alone. There was something else in the cabin with them. They could hear it moving around, scratching at the walls, and whispering in the darkness. It was getting closer, more aggressive. They knew they had to defend themselves, but they had no weapons and no way to fight back. They decided to barricade themselves in one of the rooms and wait for help to arrive. They could hear the thing outside, trying to break through the door. They could feel the energy of the thing, the rage and the hatred. It was unlike anything they had ever experienced. As they sat in silence, waiting for the inevitable, they heard a voice. It was faint, barely audible, but it was there. It was the voice of the spirit telling them its story. It had been wronged, betrayed by the family that had built the cabin. It had been trapped in the cabin, unable to leave. It had become a prisoner, a slave to its own anger and hatred. It had been waiting for someone to come and set it free. The friends realized that they had stumbled upon something that was far beyond their understanding. They had awoken something that should have remained asleep. They had disturbed the peace of the cabin, and now they were paying a price. As the night fell again, they heard a final sound. It was the sound of the door giving way, the sound of their last stand being broken. They braced themselves for the worst, but what happened next was unexpected. The spirit appeared before them in all its glory. It was a dark and twisted creature, full of pain and sorrow. But it did not attack. It simply looked at them, and then it disappeared, leaving them alone in the darkness. The friends realized that they had been given a second chance. They had survived something that should have killed them. They had witnessed something that was beyond their comprehension. They had experienced true horror, and they had come out the other side. As they left the cabin and returned to their normal lives, they knew that they would never forget what had happened. They would never forget the warning, the message, and the spirit that had haunted them in the woods. They had learned that some things should remain hidden, that some stories should not be told, and they had learned that sometimes the scariest things are the ones that are real. It was supposed to be a fun camping trip. A group of 5 teenagers had decided to spend the weekend in the deep woods, away from the stresses of school and family. They had all grown up together, and this was a chance to bond and make memories before they all went their separate ways for college. But then one of them had found something online, a secret ritual, supposedly ancient and powerful. They had all gathered around the small screen of his phone, reading the instructions and discussing whether or not they should try it. "Come on, guys," said Eric, the one who had found the ritual. "It's just a bit of harmless fun. And think of the stories we'll have to tell when we get back." The others weren't so sure. They had all heard stories of people getting hurt or even killed by messing around with things they didn't understand. But eventually, Eric wore them down. And so, as the sun began to set, they set up camp and started to prepare for the ritual. They had gathered all the necessary supplies for the ritual: candles, matches, salt, and a few other things that they weren't quite sure what they were for. Eric read the instructions again and began to recite the incantation. As he spoke, the candles flickered and the air grew colder. The forest around them seemed to come alive with strange noises, and the group of friends grew more and more uneasy. But they pressed on, reciting the words and following the steps of the ritual. That's when things started to go wrong. The ground beneath them began to shake, and the trees around them rustled as if something was moving through them. The candles went out, one by one, leaving them in darkness. Okay, said Eric, his voice shaking with fear. I think we've done enough. Let's just stop and get some sleep. But they all knew that things had gone too far. They could feel a presence in the darkness, something that was watching them and waiting. And then they heard it, a sound like whispers on the wind. The words were indistinct, but they all knew what they were saying. Leave this place, said Jake, his voice barely above a whisper. We need to leave now. But it was too late. Something had been awakened, and it wasn't going to let them go so easily. As they huddled together in their tents, the group of friends tried to come up with a plan. But it was impossible to think straight with the sound of whispers and rustling trees all around them. And then they heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving closer and closer to their campsite. Okay, we need to get out of here, said Emma, her voice shaking with fear. We can't just sit here and wait for it to come for us. But what about the ritual? Asked Eric. We have to undo it, or it's going to keep coming after us. It was a good point, but they all knew that undoing the ritual would be just as dangerous as performing it. They had no idea what they were dealing with or how to stop it. And then it happened. One of the tents was ripped open from the outside, and something lunged inside. There was a scream, and then silence. We have to run, said Jake, grabbing his backpack and heading for the woods. Now. The others followed him, stumbling through the darkness and tripping over roots and fallen branches. They could hear something behind them, something that was getting closer with every passing moment. And then they saw it, a figure, tall and twisted, with glowing eyes and a mouth full of razor-sharp teeth. It was like something out of a nightmare, and they all knew that they were in serious trouble. The creature was getting closer, and the group of friends could hear it snarling and growling as it chased them through the woods. They ran as fast as they could, but it seemed like the creature was always just a few steps behind them. Finally, they stumbled into a small clearing, and the creature stopped chasing them. It stood on the edge of the clearing, watching them with its glowing eyes. They all knew that they were trapped. What are we going to do? Asked Emma, tears streaming down her face. We're going to die here, aren't we? But then something unexpected happened. The creature began to change, its twisted form slowly morphing back into a more human-like shape. And then they saw who it was. Miss O'Neill, said Eric, his voice filled with disbelief. What are you doing here? Miss O'Neill was their high school English teacher, a strict but fair woman who had always seemed a little bit mysterious. She had disappeared from school a few days ago, and none of the students knew where she had gone. But here she was, standing in front of them in the middle of the woods. It was you, said Jake, his voice filled with anger. You put that ritual online, didn't you? You knew we would find it and try it. Miss O'Neill didn't say anything. She just looked at them with her glowing eyes, and the group of friends knew that they were in even more trouble than they thought. It all started to make sense now. Miss O'Neill had always been interested in the occult, and she had even hinted at some dark knowledge in her classes, but they had never imagined that she would go this far. Why did you do this? Asked Emma, her voice shaking. Why did you put us in danger like this? Miss O'Neill finally spoke, her voice low and menacing. I did it to awaken something that has been sleeping for a very long time. And now that it's awake, I can finally be free. The group of friends didn't know what to do. They were trapped in the clearing with a dangerous creature and their own high school teacher, who seemed to be possessed by some dark force. But then they remembered something. In the instructions for the ritual, there was a way to undo it, a way to banish whatever had been awakened. We have to undo the ritual, said Eric, his voice firm. It's the only way to stop this. Miss O'Neill laughed, a cold and bitter sound. Do you really think that will work? You've already unleashed the power, and it's too late to stop it now. But the group of friends didn't give up. They lit the candles again and recited the incantation, their voices shaking with fear and desperation. The air around them grew colder, and the creature roared in anger. And then it was over. The creature disappeared, and Miss O'Neill collapsed to the ground, unconscious. The group of friends didn't know what had happened, but they knew that they had survived the night. As they walked back to their campsite, they knew that they would never forget what had happened in the deep woods. They had faced a terrifying creature and a possessed teacher, and they had come out alive. But they also knew that they would never be the same again. They had seen things that couldn't be explained, and they knew that there was more to the world than they had ever imagined. The sun was setting as John and Sarah set up camp in the deep woods. They had been planning this camping trip for weeks and were excited to finally be out in the wilderness. As they settled in, they noticed a small cabin in the distance. It looked like it had been there for years, and they wondered if anyone lived there. The next morning, they decided to go explore the cabin. As they approached, they saw an old man sitting on the porch, staring off into the distance. He looked up and saw them, but didn't say anything. John and Sarah introduced themselves and asked if he lived there. The hermit, as they would later come to know him, nodded and told them his name was Thomas. He seemed friendly enough, but there was something off about him. His eyes had a darkness to them that made Sarah feel uneasy. They chatted for a while, and Thomas offered them some food and water. They accepted his offer, but as they ate, they began to feel dizzy and disoriented. They tried to leave, but their legs wouldn't cooperate. As they started to lose consciousness, they heard Thomas' voice whisper, "You'll never leave here." John and Sarah awoke to find themselves tied up in a small room inside the hermit's cabin. The room was dark, and they could barely see each other in the dim light. They tried to call out for help, but their voices were hoarse and weak. After a few moments of struggling, they heard the sound of footsteps approaching the door. The latch clicked, and the door creaked open. A shadowy figure entered the room, and John and Sarah could hear his ragged breathing. The hermit stepped forward into the light, and they could see the wild look in his eyes. He began to speak in a low, raspy voice, telling them that they were now his prisoners, and that he had plans for them. They were horrified to realize that they were alone in the woods with a madman who intended to do them harm. As the days passed, John and Sarah were subjected to unspeakable acts of cruelty and torture. The hermit seemed to enjoy their suffering, taunting them with his twisted words and sinister laughter. Despite their desperate attempts to escape, they were never able to break free from their captivity. The hermit was always one step ahead of them, always watching, always waiting for the right moment to strike. With each passing day, John and Sarah began to lose hope. They knew that their chances of survival were growing slimmer by the hour, and that they were running out of time. But just when all seemed lost, they managed to devise a plan to outsmart the hermit and make their escape. They worked together, using their wits and resourcefulness to stay alive. In the end, they were able to overcome their captor and make a break for freedom. It was a harrowing ordeal that left them shaken and traumatized, but they were grateful to be alive. As they stumbled out of the woods and into the light of day, they knew that they would never be the same again. The horrors they had endured would haunt them for the rest of their lives, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurks in the hearts of men. John and Sarah were rescued by the authorities and taken to the hospital for treatment. They were physically injured, but the emotional scars ran much deeper. They were haunted by nightmares and struggled with anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorder. Months passed, and they slowly began to piece their lives back together. They went to therapy and leaned on each other for support, finding solace in their shared experience. One day, while John was out running errands, he saw a familiar face on the street. It was the hermit Thomas. John's heart raced as he realized that the man who had terrorized them was still out there. He followed Thomas discreetly, trying to keep a safe distance. Thomas eventually led him to a remote cabin deep in the woods, the same one where John and Sarah had been held captive. John knew that he had to act fast. He called the police and gave them the location of the cabin. As he waited for help to arrive, he crept closer to the cabin, trying to get a better look. Suddenly, he heard a twig snap behind him. He turned around and saw Thomas standing there, his eyes filled with rage. Before John could react, Thomas lunged at him with a knife. John fought back with all his might, knowing that his life was on the line. They grappled with each other, rolling on the ground, but John managed to get the upper hand. As he pinned Thomas to the ground, John looked into his eyes and saw the same darkness that had haunted him and Sarah for so long. He realized that this man was beyond help, that he was a lost cause. The police arrived just in time to apprehend Thomas and take him into custody. John and Sarah were relieved to know that he could no longer hurt anyone else.